you know, what I've been sharing, as you know, what I've been sharing for the last couple of years, my excitement in this group is bringing together two things that I see aren't connected deeply or well in both the world of practice and research. And one is leadership and flourishing. So I work with a lot of people who are working on happiness and well-being, work and well-being. There's and the flourishing, which we're all part of with the Flourishing Initiative at Harvard. I'm in Oxford. But a lot of that work is around flourishing and more about the individual. And then there's a ton of work around leadership and purpose and those things. But connecting that our leadership is leading to flourishing, and connecting those dots, I think is something that's very exciting about what this community is bringing. And what I'm looking at and would like to share here is an observation that I think we're really good and know how to measure performance. As a general organizational perspective, we know how to measure how well we're performing. And we're starting to figure out how to measure the experience that people have and the impact of that experience. But we still need to figure out how to connect those dots to show that when you treat people well, when you put them at the center of what you're doing, it's not a nice thing to do in addition to performance, it's what drives the performance. And that to me is a big message of what we're doing here at Leadership for Flourishing, is connecting those dots. How we lead and what we do in our leadership is what drives the flourishing, and they're not separate things, they're in that same space. So when I was thinking about this gathering and also all coming together a week or so ago, January 5th, and thinking, well, we're gonna have a nice breakfast, a nice dinner, and then we'll get to talk a little bit, and I get to do a session with Scott, and that would be all cool. Thinking, what happens if we actually gathered together a bit more and actually started to see what we could work on, what we know, what we're figuring out, and what we need to figure out still to start connecting all of these dots. And this is where I came up with this idea that I'd shared with Katie and Emmy, and now with you all to get your input on it. So this is a first draft of the thinking. Basically, why we're doing this is, what do we mean by leadership for flourishing, and how do we describe it? And so what I started thinking about from my perspective, and again, I've told you, I teach in the business school and have for almost 30 years now, and in the School of Public Administration and Public Health, is thinking, what is leadership? And for us, about developing collaborative choices. And then what is flourishing? Then what is the health or well-being of the whole ecosystem, everybody in the ecosystem, however we choose to define it. And they're starting to think of what is the total value that's being generated throughout our ecosystem as a way of being able to assess the impact. That means everybody that's in our ecosystem, whether it's a supply chain, whether it's our own organization, whether it's a network, but whoever we define to be in that, what is the value that's being generated for them today? And as we intervene or participate, is the value being generated for everybody better or not? And we can assess that so that the whole system's flourishing. So when I start to divide that up and think about the kinds of questions and topics that I would find interesting, and we look at in these arenas for leadership and flourishing, then we come up with 4 very big questions that all cultures have asked for thousands of years, and around leadership or organizations. And these are the big economics, political, cultural, and social questions. And so my way of grossly simplifying that was to say, what are the capacities that we have? So in the middle, on the bottom, what are the capacities that we have for collaboration? What are the resources that we can count with in land, labor, capital, intellectual capital, social capital, but what are the things and resources that we have? Then the big political question of who decides and enforces what we do. And there are a lot of embedded agreements around who gets to decide and enforce, a la Max Weber kind of questions of how we use those capacities and what capacities we develop and use. And then what are the values or the criteria for that decision-making and enforcement? And that's the big cultural question, or the values that we use and the criteria for that decision. And then what are the rules of the game, or for the content and process and structures that we use to work with those values and making those decisions with those resources? And that's the big sociological question. So when I started thinking about everything that we've been talking about in this group for the last year plus, and how I think about leadership and organizations, started to say, well, it seems like there are these 4 big categories, and that we cover a lot of that, which I'll get to in a second. And then that led me to thinking of flourishing And while I think it's really important to look at the flourishing of the individual with a lot of the measures like we have out of Tyler's group, there are also a lot of us in the leadership realm think about organizations and communities and the other people that we impact. So what is a community-wide way of thinking about that? So here in thinking of flourishing is, what are the impacts that we're looking at? How do we know what their flourishing is, and how do we start to assess that? And then who is experiencing the flourishing, and expanding our ecosystem beyond just ourselves, but who else in our community? And how do we start to know with them what they value and what does flourishing look like for them? So that's a fire hose of sort of thinking of sort of trying to get down to some very basic questions. And then what I started to do was to play with what are some of the topic areas underneath that, and what you'll see on the next slide is then I start putting names to that. So I'm starting to think of, is there a reason for why those of us have come together and people we might invite into a gathering coming together? And starting to say, well, if we're looking at who decides and enforces, well, there's individual level work where we say that's the power is in the ability to say, I take this on for myself. I have the power to change how I think about the world. And we have a collaborative process. So maybe there's decision-making and enforcement at the individual level as well as the collaborative. Then what values are we using for those decisions? And we have a lot of work in this community on virtues and character. So how do we embody the ability to work with those virtues? And then thinking about the content and process of how do we say what we're intending to do so we're purpose-driven, and understanding that we're trying to apply this purpose or this goal or this organizing principle in different contexts, and context also matters. And then we get feedback because we actually go try something and we get feedback and something happened. So there was a change in the world because of what we did in our intervention. And then there's feedback that influences our purpose in the context that we see that in. So that we have an evolutionary process, and how do we think about that? And then these collaborative capacities, we've developed a framework we call the agreements field, of starting to look at what are the major capacities that we have for looking at land and labor and capital and these different kinds of assets that we have around our outcomes and our learning and innovation. And then I started thinking about impacts. And again, we're looking, as I said a minute ago, about individual impacts like flourishing and measures, but also communal impact. Right? How do we know if the health of the whole? And then who's experiencing, and starting to think of this whole ecosystem of stakeholders. So this started getting into what are some of the overall themes that we could include that describe and connect. We start to have some arrows starting to connect what drives what in flourishing. And then I started to say, okay, well, what would be specific things that we might look at that? And that's where, and I'm now coming this way and backwards with the people in this group. And so what's in red now are some specific themes. So you can see in the upper right, application areas, which some of you are bringing. We can apply this in business, we can apply this in education, military, policing, the political economy, youth engagement, and we already have a bunch of that richness already in this community. Then we start looking at who decides and enforces, and we can look at, well, what are the capacities that one has and how do you know that? And then what is the developmental approach to thinking about individuals taking on their decision making? And likewise for the collaborative, what are the capacities that we have and how do we know that? And then what are developmental approaches to increasing a group's capacity to collaboratively make decisions and enforce them? And something I'm very excited about, and it's also deeply embedded in this group, is working across generations and with multiple generations. So we call that 4 generations that work in the same group. It's not that the Army has 4 generations of people in the Army, but are they working in the same group? Have we learned to work together across generations in the same community? What is the richness of that? Likewise, thinking of the values and character, how do we measure what we have? And then what does developmental pathway look like for that? And so done that across these, and thinking of the ecosystem of stakeholders. What are some of these different stakeholders I've started to mention? And we know how to measure performance and impact for investors. And we know how to do that kind of within our own organization. But do we start having processes for engaging multiple folks across our ecosystem? So thinking about all of that as starting to say, okay, these are sort of details of what we're learning in each one of those areas. And then I started to put names to it. And so I sort of backed into, or came at it from the way I've presented it, as well as thinking about who's in our community. And I've missed quite a few of you in here. And so it wasn't that, this was my first take over the Christmas holidays of thinking about this, that we could fill out. But starting to say, we actually cover a lot of this map already with the community that we have. And thinking about individual capacities and development, collaborative capacities. Also, anyway, so you can see in purple that we already have in this community people covering a whole bunch of this map. And so to finish that off, what's exciting to me is we could fill this out if we wanted, but is to start saying, coming back to my first statement, we actually do know how to measure performance. There's a lot of work that's been done around that, and we're starting to figure out some of these interior experiences of individuals and groups and developmental pathways, and we have a lot of that here. And what we need to start figuring out is how to connect all these dots. So it's not that, and I'll pick on you, Scott, it's not that Scott is doing character work, and the development of character with young folks in isolation of these other things. Rather, that's what leads to these performance things. It's how that character work is being done in the decision-making processes, in content process structures. So addressing some of these other kinds of questions and impact, and we can start connecting some of these dots and say, it's when you do that character development, or Vero, your stuff around the virtues, right? We can start to say, when you do that in these contexts, these are the kinds of processes we see, these are the kinds of structures, kind of resources that have the way we look at ecosystems and impacts. So we can start connecting some of these dots. And what I see when I look at this to finish up is we've got a lot of the pieces already in place. We've already got a lot of the folks in our community who could show up together for a few days in Oxford. We already have a lot of these pieces. And then there might be a few other people that we would want to involve. Let's say we could round this out, but we have a lot of this already, and it's time to connect those. So then what I saw was we could start to come up with a book as an outcome. A couple of years ago, that Matt and Tyler came out with that book, Measuring Wellbeing. That was the product of a gathering like the one I'm proposing, where they brought a bunch of people together, spent a few days, and then said, oh, wait a second, we actually have the content for these different pieces and starting to show how they connect. So there could be a scholarly book as well as a practical book. And Katie can talk about how they've approached some people who are interested in that, as well as what are we learning from practice, and how do we could videotape or do all kinds of different ways of sharing what we're learning and starting to create the platform. We've already got a platform for that with the leadershipforflourishing.com. But we can also, so that's sort of the artifacts of what we already know. And then we can start looking at, by spending some time together on this, what are the research questions and data we want to share? What questions could we start asking because we actually have this combination of all of us doing this? And then what is the platform for sharing and community building around people who are showing connecting the dots for leadership for flourishing? So that's my whirlwind fire hose through an idea that I had of how we could think about outputs for coming together and why it would be really valuable to spend maybe 3 or 4 days together this fall, or this spring, sorry, in May, to start working towards this. So that was my idea.
Thank you so much, Jim. That is so exciting. Let's take some responses. I'll stop the recording as well.